Hello and welcome to All to Do with the Blue. I'm your host, Rowan Whites, and this is a show where we talk about everything and anything to do with water. And today our guest is a ships and boat enthusiast, hobbyist. Peter, how you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Just another lovely day over here, good old Eastern Coast America. Having a great time. Can't wait to talk about whatever I know about ships. Now, I may not be the best, more or less what I know is what stuff, caught my interest, and I would just love to share as much of, what I know. I'll say whatever I can.
Awesome, man. Yeah, so you're coming to us today with some knowledge on a ship that at its time was something in itself. Can you tell us a little bit about that ship?
Yeah, so what I will be discussing will be the KMS Bismarck, which was considered by most to be the largest battleship built by European powers. Now, of course, the title of the biggest battleship ever is actually held by the Yamato, or was held by the Yamato back in World War II. That ship displaced about 70, I can't remember the exact figure, but about 70 something thousand tons under full combat load. For Japanese, with all their resource problems in World War II, that is a crazy feat of engineering on its own. But for Germany, especially post World War II, building a ship that displaced about 50,000 tons, at least the Bismarck, the lead ship Bismarck, displaced about 50,000 tons. That is a crazy, thing from history, because the entire country was basically like knocked down quite a few pegs because from World War I they could not remilitarize at all. Of course, from history that was all thrown out the window, but they were able to just ignore the treaties, everything, somehow get enough materials to not only design but to lay down a ship that, like I said, became 50,000 tons when it was fully finished. And her sister ship, Tirpitz, actually was even, because of all extensive wartime modifications, in the end of it, she actually weighed even more than the Bismarck itself. She weighed 52,000 tons. But I won't digress about that much more. I mean, I'll try to stick more to the Bismarck, what years it was, what year it was laid down, what year it was finished, commissioned, and I will discuss its ultimate fate later on.
Cool. So, wow. So that was just some other information about just those ships, and we didn't even touch base yet into the Bismarck. So, why did you choose the Bismarck today?
So, I mean, I specifically wanted to talk about the Bismarck because I have what I would like to consider the stronger ties to Europe. I came from Europe. I mean, granted, I came here when I was very young, but Europe, Poland, is my home country. So is this hits particularly close to home. So it's why I specifically wanted to talk about it, because there's a lot of ties to it. So I found it also very interesting. I discussed how a country that was so militaristically, that everybody tried to keep it down, somehow made something that was very good for as long as it lasted. That's why I would like to talk about the Bismarck.
So you're saying like when you say that they kind of like kept it under wraps almost in a way. It's like how did they do that? Like
No, like, honestly, from Germany did not really keep this under wraps. Like, they basically, from what I understand from history, they refuted all of those like naval treaties, or maybe they kind of skirted, because I believe the tonnage limit that the naval treaties disclosed was that a battleship, whatever country was allowed it, could not have a gun larger than 16 inches. The shells could not be larger than 16-inch in diameter, or the displacement could not be more than 35,000 tons. Now, I believe Germany just, at least in that case, outright refuted it. There were some previous ship classes that they did kind of like, on design, unloaded, the ships did weigh that whatever the limit was on those naval treaties, but under combat load they displaced more. So they kind of got around it by skirting it in a way, but that's more or less what I understand on it.
so Germany's basically like we're just gonna do whatever the hell we want to do.
Yeah, I mean, from that point in history, they kind of stopped caring about treaties because
Yeah.
they were militarizing for, we would find out, September 1st, 1939, to be the Great War.
So what led into the happenings of the Bismarck?
So, well, I mean, I would just bring this into 1936. So I never, I don't have the full story about why they specifically named the Bismarck, other than most of their ships. Well, actually, maybe now that I think about it, most of their ships were named after, a lot of their bigger ships were named after like key important historical figures or leaders of Germany. So Bismarck makes me think of Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, if memory serves correctly. So maybe that's why their largest ship ever. That's probably why they named it, after someone who came up with the whole concept. I believe it was called the Realpolitik, if I remember the term right. But regardless, that's digressing from the naval aspect. So I think they just named it after somebody important. Now I don't know Tirpitz, the sister ship. Honestly, I never really looked into too much of the historical, significance of that name. But
Cool. And so when it came to the end of its life, what was happening with the ship, and how did that come about?
okay, I'll give it basically a rundown from beginning to the end. So the ships usually they go through four important celebrated instances throughout their entire life cycle. Laying down, when the keel, the body of the ship is laid down, that like the very base of the ship is laid down. That's the first celebrated instance because that is when construction officially begins on the ship. Then you have commissioning. That's usually, or no, excuse me, that's wrong. So that would be, then the second instance is launching. That is when the ship is considered complete. It gets rolled off from the docks into the water, and more or less, they hope it floats. You could be like modern day North Korea now, where they tried to do a sideways launch on one of their destroyers they created, they produced, but it capsized.
So that was my boat last year, man.
Yeah.
my little speedboat.
Yeah. But you see, so you pretty much launch and pray. But that's the second celebrated instance where a lot of important figures are in. Third one is commissioning.
Wait, can I cut you off for a 2nd?
Mhm.
I'm so sorry. Is the launch when like they would do the bottle smash thing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, when you see it roll down too. So, and then you have commissioning. That's when they officially, from the manufacturer or the producer, whichever shipyard produces that, creates that ship. That's when commissioning is, when it officially gets transferred over to whoever, whether it's military, whether it's civilian, whoever commissioned that ship. And then finally, if it makes it to it, you have decommissioning, when it's time to retire the ship. That's it.
How, in your opinion, no, this is just your opinion, how often do ships make it to decommissioning, do you think?
Well, if they're not wartime ships, they'll usually always make it,
And
unless there's something like, let's say, something catastrophic happens, like called like hull breach or whatever. Usually most ships will make it.
Sorry, Titanic.
And then, yeah, sorry, Titanic, indeed. I mean, sometimes anything like that happens, and then usually, with exception of most American battleships that were used in service, most ships will eventually make their way to be scrapped. Think about it like that. A big, usually on average, let's just say 40,000 battleship, that's a lot of scrap there. But there's a lot of, some ships have a lot of historical significance, so it would be nice to, keep them around. But unfortunately, a lot of countries don't have the resources, whether, their own, you know, their own taxpayer dollars or whatever, they might not generate enough of them to keep those ships around, so they'll just sell it off to a scrap yard, and unfortunately, that's it. Bye bye. Like the British, the most important ship, the Warspite. Unfortunately, as decorated as she was during World War II, her fate was to be scrapped because they couldn't keep her around.
Wow, I had no idea. So it's kind of like a full cycle.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool.
And then you have, but however, you have the great America that has a lot of resources, a lot of money flowing around. You can have things, you can have ships like the North Carolina in North Carolina that's being kept as a museum ship. You have all four you have all four Iowas that are museum ships. So you have one in New Jersey, you have the Wisconsin in Norfolk, Virginia, the Missouri in Pearl Harbor, and you have Iowa. I forget the city, but in California.
And these are all ships you can go visit.
Yes, these are all battleships that you can go visit. And then there's also, I believe, the Texas down in Texas.
Wow,
And the USS Texas is one of America's, I believe, one of America's last surviving dreadnoughts, super dreadnoughts.
Have you visited that one or no?
No, unfortunately, I have not.
Do you want to?
It is on my bucket list of things to do, but I would like to right now stick to more like ships that were relatively more modern, because I like more of like the closer to World War II era type stuff. And now the ship I visited recently in Japan, the Mikasa, she herself had more significance for Japan, but maybe I might discuss that at another time.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, you're always welcome back.
Mm-hmm. I mean, because that was like something interesting to go out to a whole foreign country and kind of see how they display the ship. Because like the biggest thing that I got to say I was quite intrigued by with their museum part of their ship is they actually had simulated. They had like VR headsets. They had VR, like they were simulator machines where you can go in and kind of like try to. You basically have a little recreation of the battle, like the significant battle of Tsushima.
That's sick.
So that was like interesting. Yes, it is.
That's really cool.
It was interesting to put the VR headset in and just kind of look around.
Yeah, and you're on the ship at the same time, so you get to. It's like an interactive game.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, granted, with the VR headset, you were just more watching.
Okay.
You had no input on that, but there was one that basically, you had like basically a steering wheel, and you're just kind of trying to maneuver the fleet. Because when you're having a naval engagement, positioning is very important, and the historical significance of the Battle of Tsushima was that I forget I do not know, do not recall the name of the admiral presently, but he came up with a type of strategy called crossing the T. The significance of crossing the T is usually most ships at the time, the dreadnought era, the early 1900s, most ships usually had two main batteries, so two big cannons, usually on the fore and the aft of the ship, the front and the back of the ship. And then a host of other smaller, not similar, but like smaller, but all uniform caliber secondaries. So now, if you have crossing the T, the opposing fleet has only the front turrets facing the ship. So you think about it, that's basically cutting off like half of the firepower of the ship.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the opponent getting crossed has only. Or the opponent getting crossed is going to be bearing both the fore and the aft end of the enemy ship's firepower. So like let's say usually most of them had dual turrets. So you have 4 separate shells at the same time, or depending on, the salvo had the same amount of shells fired, they would be raining down on the enemy. Now that's double the firepower compared to yours where you're only firing 2, 1 turret at the same time.
Oh yeah. Big advantage.
Mm-hmm. Regardless, this maneuver is was very significant because it's basically allowed the Japanese with a much inferior fleet to defeat a much more superior Russian fleet, which Russia's Navy during both world wars never really had, a great amount of accomplishments. Because, I mean, as a little digression, I mean, so we're kind of breaking off for a little bit from the German side of things. There was a very interesting story. So the Russian fleet, when they received orders from the European side, I believe either from St. Petersburg or Murmansk up in northern Russia, they received orders to make their way down to Japan. So they had to, in the early 1900s, the Russian fleet, when they were sailing, they sailed for a few days, and they must have already thought they made it their way to Japan because I believe it was that they communicated with command that they already made contact with the Japanese fleet, but what they made contact with were British fishing boats.
Oh, jeez.
And that, I believe, is the only time the story, because I don't know enough of it to go into super detail. Because they didn't know where they were on the map, they thought they were already engaging Japan, but now they did not. And I believe,
sir, it's the fishermen,
yeah,
sir.
it's the fishermen, but they thought they were the Japanese. And I believe the fishermen lost nobody, but the Russians lost a sailor.
How?
I don't recall the exact how the casualty happened, but somehow, whether it was from friendly fire or somehow when they were capturing the fishermen, one of the Russian sailors unfortunately died.
Oh my
So
God.
that was an interesting story of its own right there. But regardless, then when they got down all the way to Japan, another mistake that happened is that the Russian fleet, I believe it was an escorting destroyer or torpedo boat, they got behind a ship that they thought was another friendly Russian ship. However, it was a Japanese torpedo boat, I believe it was. I may not know the exact history, it's just more or less the kind of what happened here.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, they were thinking that they were in formation with a friendly ship, but it was a hostile ship that ended up alerting the bigger Japanese fleet in Tsushima of the threat that was present, and then the whole battle began.
Damn,
So
you're
Russia,
0-2, Russia. You're 0-2.
so Russia was very, very unprepared, and they just did not have the right, not the right experience with naval combat in World War One.
Well, the only way to get more is doing it, right?
Mm-hmm. Or maybe, I mean, my years may be wrong here, but either this was during World War One or it was a little bit before. Well, it's one of those, but it's just an interesting thing of history.
No, for sure. Those are good stories. I enjoy that. History like that, is something else to talk about.
Yeah, Russia never really had a great time. I don't know much of their stories, from World War II. I haven't really had a chance to research.
So let's get back on topic for the Bismarck. So tell us the rest of the story for that.
Alrighty. So she was laid down 1936. She was finished 1939. She underwent sea trials, so pretty much where they just test the seaworthiness of the ship. So there was a little issue that they found with her. Was the only thing that they found is that she could not steer well with propeller steering, because usually most ships they'll have a rudder to allow it to change direction on the water. So they were testing to see if you could just slow down the propellers on one side, much like how a tank operates, where if you want to turn the tank, you slow down one side and let the other track overtake it. They tried the same system, but she could not turn very well.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a kayak when you're kayaking.
Yeah, pretty much. So they found, but they chose to proceed with commissioning the ship in 1940. So the Bismarck, however, had a very relatively short life. She was only basically around for about 2 years before she, unfortunately, underwent a battle that was very, very significant. So I believe the month was June of 1941. Can't recall exact dates here, but she received orders along with a heavy cruiser called Prinz Eugen. They received orders to make their way into the Atlantic to start basically harassing, I believe, to harass shipping convoys, because the Bismarck herself, she could steam at about 28, 30 knots, which I believe if you convert that to
mile per hour,
might be like about 28, basically almost the same. I can't recall the exact conversion, but about 28, 30 miles an hour. So she was relatively fast for a battleship. Well, granted, most World War II battleships could steam, even the Iowas could steam at 33 knots. So pretty fast. But regardless, so her and the heavy cruiser got those orders. What they were not expecting was to engage a very, very important, popular British battle cruiser or battleship, depending on what you want to call it. So they were steaming. Of course, they assumed that they were not going to be found, like very early on, but a lot of evidence points to that the Allies were basically aware that she was already moving out and about as soon as the operation started. So they got spotted by two British, or initially spotted by a Swedish fleet, can't recall the name, but which of course made its way rounds through Sweden, and then the ambassador to Sweden found out and told all the people in the UK, or England, and now you have the Royal Navy was alerted, so they were out looking around. Bismarck was spotted by two heavy cruisers, shadowed, there was an engagement, but the heavy cruisers broke away because obviously there was no way they could engage. Here is some significance right here. The Bismarck fired a few salvos at those heavy cruisers. Now, the thing that may be a little bit interesting for now is that the shock from the cannons firing, because you have 15-inch shells that could weigh up, in 1,000 or so pounds, being shot at most like about 30 kilometers. So maybe you could shoot them as far as like 20 something miles. So that's a lot of explosive force right there. And the shock of firing her A and B, Anton and Bruno. I forget which exact turret may have caused it, maybe all of them, but the salvo that was fired from the turrets knocked her early warning radar system out. So, I mean, the significance of it is the only thing is that basically Bismarck had to abandon the lead ship role and she had to fall behind in station behind Prince Eugen. Another interesting thing, the Prince Eugen and the Bismarck were designed to look similar. Of course, it's a relatively minor thing in the history of things because that ship got confused. The British initially confused the Prince Eugen for the Bismarcks. They were initially trying to engage the heavy cruiser first later on. But as it progressed, so let's just say because the heavy cruisers broke off, they kept shadowing just to keep alerting. So in a few days of the operation, the ship named, I know the Hood was definitely involved. The most awarded, one of the most most renowned ships of the Royal Navy. The Hood and I believe the Prince of Wales. They got into an engagement with the Bismarck. Now this is a very significant event here because the Bismarck, I'm not going to go too much into detail, eventually scored a very catastrophic hit on the Hood, which caused a absolutely massive fireball to shoot out from the back of the ship. The explosion was so massive that the ship broke in two. It actually broke in two. The front of the Hood ended up eventually like the whole ship sunk within 3 minutes. Picture that. You have a big ship, a big battleship or battle cruiser, because the notion between the two can get confused in this case. And she sinks in 3 minutes with the loss of about 1,400 sailors in 3 minutes. And even when she was going under, when she was starting to tip, the bow came way out of the water. The last remaining crew in the front of the Hood tried to fire off a salvo. They did actually fire a salvo, but of course, it wasn't going to do anything.
While it was sinking?
Yes.
What?
They fired one last salvo.
Oh my God.
And that's it. That was it for the Hood. The reason this is important is because this galvanized the entire Royal Navy. The Hood was their prized ship. Everybody loved the Hood, the mighty Hood, the reputation of the mighty Hood. They were thinking, the entire British country, they were thinking the Hood is unsinkable. It got sunk in a few salvos. And that was something crazy for the British. They did not expect this. So
they're pissed now.
They were very pissed. And the thing is, of course, throughout the battle, Bismarck continued to engage I believe it was the Prince of Wales. So there was still that engagement, but of course, Bismarck scored enough hits. Prince of Wales was also suffering malfunctions of their own, not from damage, but their own malfunctions on their turrets, so they broke off. And the crazy thing is, Bismarck most likely should have continued the fight because they could have most likely also sunk the Prince of Wales. But because they didn't do that, they were able to bring the message, a lot of information back. And Bismarck also suffered damage of their own, which one of them was damage to the bow, which caused oil to leak out from behind the ship. That also rendered them unable to use 1,000 tons of fuel because the line got cut. Mm-hmm. So now that oil streak you could see it from way up. So it gave it such an easy access, such an easy way for them to track the ship. And of course, being damaged, no longer capable of continuing the operation, they were trying to figure out, where do we return the ship? So they could not go back to Norway anymore. I think they were already too far. they made the choice, I believe, to go to France. But here's the thing. You already have all of the entire Royal Navy following you. You galvanize the entire country. They're going to stop at nothing to sink you. And so that's how the battle began. I believe the Prince of Wales also made a comeback, and it was a lot of different British ships engaging the Bismarck. The significance of this battle also, and interestingly enough, is during this time in World War II already, you were having monoplane, monowing, so regular like modern planes that you see today. You were having a lot of piston, they were still piston, propelled planes, but the interesting, they could fly very fast, very like, up to at least, 300, 400 miles an hour, maybe not level, but more in like a shallow dive. The interesting thing was throughout the battle with Bismarck, a slow World War I era swordfish made a devastating strike which rendered the rudder of the Bismarck inoperable. So now the ship, and I believe the reason the swordfish was because weather was not good, but also because the swordfish most likely flew way slower than most of the modern target, acquisition systems on the AA cannons. They could not account for a plane going that slow. And I believe that is why they could not shoot that swordfish down. So now you have the Bismarck, which its only method of turning is unable to turn. They're basically going in a circle. Propeller steering, as was discovered in sea trials, does not work. So the ship cannot do anything. So at that point, they're stuck. You're circling in the same position, and the enemy fleet is closing.
Oh, so they're just waiting for the end at this point.
Basically, that's what's waiting in the end. They tried to, at some point, to send out the ship diary, the battle diary. I forget, maybe there's a different term for it. I can't recall the exact term right now. They tried to send it out with their float plane, but battle damage prevented them from being able to send it out because it was deemed like the steam line was cut.
You're talking about the Bismarck?
Yes,
right?
This is still the Bismarck. They tried to send the diary, the steam line was cut. They can't send the diary out anymore. So basically the ship is going to go down. Not much information is going to get out of it. Either way, the entire Royal Navy circled in. She's getting shelled left and right. She's knocked inoperable because of multiple ship, damage sustained from the battle. She can't do anything. But interestingly enough, she's not sinking. Even as the British ships closed to get more accurate shots, she still wasn't sinking. She just couldn't fight back because the crew has already received orders to abandon ship. And it is very debatable about what really happened, whether she was sunk by battle damage or whether she was sunk by being scuttled. Because from what I remember, they received the order to scuttle the ship. So open all the bulkheads, open everything, and allow water to get into the entire ship. So, but because of already battle damage sustained, it's hard to say, did she get sunk by the British or did she sink because of the crew's actions? Compared to the Hood, there was a lot more survivors because they were allowed to get off the ship. The Hood sunk in 3 minutes, only 3 people survived.
Oh, wow. That's it.
But a lot more of the survivors of the Bismarck made it out. The British ended up, taking as many of them as they could, POWs, as many of them as they could. I believe the main admiral of the ship, the captain and the admiral, they went down with the ship. But for being one of the largest European ships, European produced ships, she had a relatively short life, but that's just because the Royal Navy just happened to have a lot more significant, amounts of ships available. And the Prince Eugen managed to make it out. The only reason that a lot of the survivors of the Bismarck that got taken in by German is because the Royal Navy chose not to stick around much longer because German U-boats were spotted in the area. So then once the Royal Navy cleared out, the rest of the sailors got rescued by the German U-boats.
Yeah, U-boats have a whole other history themselves.
Yes, that's not something I'm much as knowledgeable about. So other than you're in pretty much a metal coffin, iron coffin under the water under pressure.
Well, that Bismarck story was quite. I learned a lot today for that. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
What a way to go! I mean, they really got screwed once the oil was leaking, and
Mm-hmm.
once you can't turn, that's it. I mean, they had no other choice but to go down.
Yeah, choose to keep fighting, but keep going out. But at some point, damage got too much.
That's war for you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that story. That was awesome. That you're really good at your history. With all this knowledge, how did you first get into ships and boats? I can tell you're passionate about it.
Well, actually, a lot of you might find it kind of funny. It's actually from video games.
Okay,
So
nothing wrong with that.
the first game that I played that brought me into the kind of understanding the more naval side of things was World of Warships. What I found interesting about it is, first of all, the just imagining the level of challenge that the not even the captains, more the plotting room had to go through to accurately lay down salvos on the enemy ships. Because you think about it, you're not standing still on the ship, or the ship is not staying still. You are a moving platform. You are a moving artillery platform. Your opponent is a moving artillery platform. So you have to account for your movement. You have to account for the enemy movement. I just, even this is modeled in World of Warships. I found it very challenging at first because, you don't think about it. The fact that you have to account for your own motion, granted, not so much in the game, but, your own pitching and, moving waves, balancing because of the waves and everything, pitching, healing, you have to account for that. It's like that was just like so interesting to me. So I, thought more about it. Then, took a little break from that, from World of Warships, because it was hard for me to get used to it. Then at the time, War Thunder, you might not like the name War Thunder, you hear it a lot, but that's when War Thunder had their closed beta test for ship, gameplay as well. So I tried more of that. I found that to be even more interesting because now that one was less arcadey compared to World of Warships, because just like World of Warships, you have to account for your the movement of the ships. You have to lead and or aim differently depending on which direction, whether you're going when you're going parallel, anti-parallel. You have to account for that movement, and that was just very interesting and challenging. And War Thunder, it did not have an HP system, like a health point system like World of Warships does. You actually have to knock the crew out, or eliminate the crew, or you have to detonate the magazine or sink the ship. So there's three ways you can take the ship out, and that was much more interesting to me than World of Warships, where it was just an HP system. But either way, so you go from there. You their selection at the time was very limited, so that's when it was my first exposure. Took a break from that, and then a few years later came back when it was a little bit more, and then they once I came back to it a few years later, they started to introduce battleships. So I worked my way up because unfortunately War Thunder, it's like a progression based game. You have to play a lot of battles to unlock the next ship. So I worked my way up the battleship. So that's when it really got interesting. Big, you're a big battleship. So like that's where I'm like thinking, you're in a ship that weighs like 30,000, depending on 30,000 up to 70,000, depending on which ship you are. And it's like you have so much power. You shoot the cannons. You are sending a large salvo of large projectiles, and it's crazy. You can shoot them like 30 miles. And so either way, I got interested in that. Made me start looking up the histories of these warships. You find out all the cool little interesting things like the Bismarck, the stories behind them. You find also like some cool interesting things. I'm not going to go into too detail on this, but radar. It's all so interesting, and the fact that initially throughout World War One to World War Two, most naval target acquisition was done by visual, or like the first initial ranging, or excuse me, not ranging, but they required visual sight on the opponent to engage.
It's crazy to think about how much technology we've gone through, evolved through, and built.
Yes, and the U.S. Navy and the British Royal Navy were the only powers in World War II that could engage enemy ships without a visual, without seeing the ship, visual contact, because of their radar system.
Yeah, because they were ahead of the game at that point.
Britain was actually the first one to come up with like a higher power, receiver or like a transmitter. I don't know too much about it, but they were the first ones. They were the leaders of the technology, so they shared it with the U.S. So the U.S. could, has the higher industrial base, so they could work more with it. And it's very interesting to me that both those countries, the UK and America, they just took it, ran with it, incorporated it actively into their doctrine. And it's just crazy to think about how like you can engage someone, an enemy ship, miles away, beyond visual range. You do not even see the ship at all, but because you have radar contact, you can get its speed, you can get its heading. The fact that you could just plot a target solution and send shells where you can't even see where they land.
You know what this all comes from? Math.
Yes,
lots of math.
Naval combat is very math heavy.
And you got to think, like, even getting into it, this just by playing a video game, it really makes you think, wow, you're one person, and on these ships are hundreds of people.
Not even hundreds. When I was on the Wisconsin in Norfolk, Virginia 2 years ago, when I was touring the ship, at some point the tour guide told us, because the Wisconsin went through multiple cycles. She was commissioned for World War II. She was used in Korea, the Korean War, at some point to shell North Korean positions. And interesting story, she once got hit by a North Korean artillery battery, a coastal battery that was like 105, I believe 105 or 152, one of those two, relatively smaller caliber. No damage inflicted at all. The Wisconsin responded by firing 406 millimeter shells, 16-inch shells against a small artillery emplacement. Temper is what the escorting destroyer signal or sent the message to. Temper.
That's funny.
Yeah, there's many interesting stories, but even then, it's like, you think about it. So the Iowa class ships, they had World War II was their main, year war of service, and then throughout like shore bombardment through other times. Then they got decommissioned. Then two of them got recommissioned. I believe the Missouri and the Wisconsin. They got recommissioned to serve in the Gulf War. So they got modernized. An interesting fact that I learned on my trip to the Wisconsin, they also at some point got computerized target acquisition systems for their main battery cannons. However, the very violent nature of shooting those turrets resulted in that computerized system breaking up.
Oh, jeez.
So an interesting fact is that they had to bring on retired Navy veterans to basically train this modern, new, young crew how to acquire targets the old-fashioned way. And I'm not very well knowledgeable on the whole, plotting room aspect of stuff, but I just think it's very interesting that you have to bring back very, at this point, older World War II veterans just to show the new people how to use the old equipment. And I believe Wisconsin or the Missouri were the last two ships ever to use an analog system in naval combat. And now those two, American ships, the Missouri and the Wisconsin, they also were modernized with Tomahawks, Seaweed system, close-in weapon support systems to shoot down, incoming missiles and drones or, whatever it can be intercepted. And the story that I heard also from the Wisconsin is one of those veterans, they had to have somebody with him all the time. So picture when you're walking through a door. It's not an open door like it is on your house. It's a bulkhead. So there's also a little bit of you have to step over a little wall to cross through the door. So the old veteran had to have somebody with him to help him through the doors and someone to hold his coffee for him. So that's like another interesting thing.
Let me show you how it's done, Sonny.
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, that's kind of like what I feel like that's going to happen later on, because it's going to be like, oh, everything's controlled by AI. For some reason, system goes down. People are going to be like, well, now we got to do it the old way. It's like,
yeah, then with technology progression, well, that's just how it goes, I guess.
Yeah, always got to divert back to something. If something don't work, you got to come up with another way, or go back to another way that did work.
Old-fashioned way.
Yep. Do you yourself own a boating license?
No, however, I do not.
Do you want one?
It's a tough question. I mean, because I do have an interest in boats, but personally, I believe my interest would lie more on just learning about them. Maybe I personally don't think I would enjoy being out at sea very much myself.
Seasickness? Are you worried?
Nah,
you've learned too much.
Yeah, you learn too much. You learn many histories or like many stories about what happened, like the Indianapolis being sunk, and then all the people, all the sailors just watching as they go. The other sailors go under, sharks. It's just many different things, many different events, occurrences that can happen out at sea.
Yeah, trust me. I know. I gave a little description of a fun time I had on my first episode introduction. This is just a random question. What would you do if you were on a sinking ship?
Well, now that depends. Where am I on the ship?
Where would you prefer to be if you're on a sinking ship? Where do you want to be for the chance of survival? I guess
the highest chance of survival I can imagine would be the superstructure, the part that sticks above the hull, because you're the furthest from being underwater. If you are in the boiler room, you are in the lowest part of the ship, and there's the ships. I've walked through the Wisconsin a lot. It can be a maze while navigating through the entire ship. And in picture, like the Wisconsin, the Iowa class ships were designed to have about 2,000 people. Wartime is significant wartime conditions. They can have up to 3,000 people now. Imagine if you have a small city trying, or a small town trying to at the same time evacuate from a ship.
Yeah.
So you have this mad rush to get out from let's say the boiler room, the lowest level of the ship, but the water's coming in fast. You are listing. You are starting to, depending on where the breach was, you are starting to turn and lean basically into the water. If you are on the lower level of the ship, it gets harder and harder. And for all you know, you might get flooded. Like your compartment might get flooded, and there you go. That's it.
So I know that or maybe this is only for submarines. I'm not sure. I'd imagine it's on boats and parts of the hull specifically. You could like close doors off in case it fills up with water, and like you could take some water and close off and still float a vessel.
If you can close the bulkheads, but at some point the pressure becomes too much and the water might eventually start leaking through the bulkhead.
Okay.
If it takes on too much.
It's kind of like a last resort, kind of like if it starts happening, like I got to get to shore ASAP or get these people off this boat before.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I mean, and if let's say the breach is not big enough and the crew can, patch it up, stop it, it's all right. If the breach is also, let's say if they choose not to patch it up, if the ship starts leaning or listing, they can choose to counterflood the other side of the ship. And so that can correct the list. So let's say you have a 4-degree list, you can just counterflood and maybe correct it to 2, or maybe even just level it out. Oh, you never know. You can counterflood other departments, but that's only really done if it can be, salvaged.
That's cool. I never even knew that. On the topic of submarines, have you ever visited one of those? Have you ever been in a submarine?
No, I have not, but I would like to at some point. I would like to go to one. There is one granted, the only thing about it is that it's like cut away. Like you don't really go in this, or at least from what I've seen, you don't really go in the submarine because it's like a cutout. Like half the ship is sliced open, so you could just kind of look in and see it. I would like to go see one submarine, but maybe because I know there is a full like submarine in Europe. So maybe one of these days when I'm done, like seeing the battleships, I might go choose to see that.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Because that's like another, interesting little thing of World War II history as well, with the German, wolf packs, the technology to hunt them down by the Allies. So many different interesting things.
So after you're done seeing all the ships that you want to see and you start going to look at some submarines maybe, for the ships that you can't see or that you can't go on, for anything that might be out on commission or in water right now that you know of that civilians aren't allowed to go on, if you got the opportunity to go on one, is there a ship that you would go look at right now if you could?
I mean, so what I would like to definitely see is the inside of like one of the current modern, whether it's a submarine or an aircraft carrier. I would like to see one of present day America's, nuclear powered fleet, because I would love to see like what the inside of that power plant looks like. Because even now, like present day propulsion is still basically heating water to turn a turbine to turn a propeller. Because much like, ships of World War II, you still use steam to propel ships these days, at least from my understanding of how nuclear is still just heating water. So I would love to see like what the inside of the Nimitz class carriers looks like, more on the power plant side, or one of the current nuclear submarines. And kind of more of an oddball one, but the Admiral Kuznetsov, a Russian aircraft carrier, has a very bad reputation of being one of the worst performing aircraft carriers, also due to lots of mechanical issues. I'd love to see how mistreated that ship must be, because there was also like an interesting history I read, or like a story I read in World War II, how the Russian fleet received a Lend-Lease ship from the UK. That ship, after the war, was returned with its main firing director missing, because the Russians most likely took it. Or maybe I have the timeline wrong, but either way, at some point when the British received the ship, the director was missing because the Russians probably took it to reverse engineer it. And the ship was also a rat motel infested with cockroaches, all sorts of signs of bad treatment. And of course, most likely because of the mentality that it's not really ours, so why do we need to take good care of it? Granted, I know they're currently at war and everything, so that's not a thing, but I just like to see how it looks on the inside. How taken care of it is.
Yeah, hopefully better maintained nowadays, I guess you'd say.
It was still having a lot of issues even these days, from what I remember reading about it.
They got to get on that.
Yeah, right.
Well, man, it's really been fun talking to you. I learned a lot today, man. Thanks, Peter, for coming on today and telling us that story about the Bismarck, the history behind it. And not just that ship, but a couple other stories too. The fisherman one was really something for me. I can't believe that. But there's always times like that in history, I guess. Even during war, there's some funny mishaps. But thank you for coming on, and I really hope you had fun, and maybe we'll get you back on one day to talk about some more history, or when you go visit something else. And I hope you have a great night, man.
I'm sure was, grateful for the opportunity to provide what I may know. Some details are fuzzy. Maybe some things might not be remembered correctly, but it's, there's a lot of different stories. There's a lot to learn, to read about in World War II. So if you have an interest in any, war aspects, maybe even particularly just the more challenges of, naval combat, definitely something to, look into. And maybe, fact check some of the things I mentioned. Maybe you might, when you do that, maybe you might find some more interesting facts from like those stories or those issues too. And just, it can take you down a rabbit hole of information.
Yeah, that's what inspiration does, man. You find something you like and you get inspired about learning more, and just you get down the rabbit hole. But yeah, thanks again, man. And for anyone else who would like to share a story or get on the show and talk about something related with water, you can reach me at ATDWTB@gmail.com. Send me a little message, a little blurb, and let's get you on the show. All right, guys. Thanks. Have a great night.